Before we get started, there will be spoilers for Jujutsu Kaisen in the video to come. Jujutsu Kaisen is full of weird and wonderful characters wielding equally surprising and unique abilities. Cursed techniques that control blood, shadow, other people's corpses, and yes, infinity itself. And yet, amidst this sea of creativity, one character stands tall above the rest, at least in my humble opinion, and leapt off the page in such a way as to really catch my eye. Through their innate technique, this particular character seamlessly blends their outward design and lifestyle with their powers in a way that feels not only extremely natural, but is visually striking too. Hiromi Higuruma, a discontent, detached lawyer turned sorcerer, wields the power of deadly sentencing, along with a litany of judiciary-themed abilities and weaponry, creating one of the most cohesive and interesting fighting styles of the series, and in my opinion, giving us perhaps Jujutsu Kaisen's most unique character. But don't just take my word for it. Instead, join me as we take a deeper look at Higuruma's power of deadly sentencing and everything that comes with it, plus how it's used initially in the source material and what really made it stand out to me in such a potent way. Alright, without further ado, this is a look at one of the series' best and most interesting standout characters and his fascinating technique, an inherently non-lethal yet still terrifying courtroom where judgments are delivered. So, who is Higuruma and what makes him one of Jujutsu Kaisen's most well-realized characters? And how does this all tie back into the powerful ability found at the nexus of his characterization? Once a defense attorney with a strong belief in justice, Higuruma strove to do whatever was necessary to help those who couldn't help themselves in the impartial, perhaps even to some people, blind eyes of the law. Higuruma would take on cases that seemed impossible in order to try and get a better outcome for those that were wrongly accused. But it wasn't necessarily out of a cliché desire to help the weak and the powerless. Instead, he simply wanted to be the only one to keep his eyes open in a world that often keeps them shut. Even with the odds stacked against them, Higuruma would readily put himself in harm's way on the front lines of the legal system, finding himself in the firing line of those who dared to hope he could save them. Immediately, it is a powerful setup for a character. Higuruma fascinates me because he feels uniquely average and even bland. In a world as quirky and weird as that of Jujutsu Kaisen's, Higuruma is dressed down in a simple suit, and his demeanor is that of a cold and serious, perhaps even glum, loner. And yet his rage at the system feels very real. There is a passion there that is burning up. It's Higuruma's conviction that makes him more than the sum of his parts and helps find him a place among the rest of the cast. Higuruma is one of the best, clearest examples in the series that power can be born out of anywhere, even in some of the most downtrodden, those that struggle quietly through life. All of this is to say that Higuruma is one of Jujutsu Kaisen's most human characters. A man who forsook his own mental health to keep fighting an impossible fight. There are some really striking moments found throughout the sequence that depicts Higuruma's ultimate rise and fall. The man on trial bursting into tears before his lawyer, elated and unable to contain himself over the simple fact that someone believed him when no one else would, when it seems as though he's been found innocent thanks to Higuruma's defense. And then to see that hard-earned moment casually flipped on its head as Higuruma is faced with that same man's now damning, accusing eyes when the appeal instead brands him as guilty, in a system seemingly rigged against him from the very start. It feels inevitable. It's a chilling moment, and it doesn't need any crazy powers, insane fight scenes, or vicious bloodthirsty monsters to get its point across. The defendant's enraged, betrayed eyes are all we need to believably understand why Higuruma snapped, and what the foundations of what would become his power were really built on. And speaking of which, the moment Higuruma's power comes into being as he slams the gavel down upon the desk is a great, striking moment. An excellent cliffhanger that details the sudden transformation of a man about ready to take the law into his own hands. And in a sense, that's a great segue into what Higuruma's power actually is. Deadly sentencing. Despite his mild-mannered outward appearance, Higuruma was nonetheless a brilliant lawyer, and it seems like that talent transferred when he became a sorcerer during the culling game. Higuruma discovered he had a natural proficiency for combat and a high skill level, enabling him to get the most out of his innate technique. The thing is, the theme of Higuruma's power translates perfectly to a domain, so it's not surprising it turned out so well. The idea of facing someone down one-on-one in an inescapable trap is absolutely perfect for a dynamic, climactic courtroom duel. The fact Higuruma's power is a non-lethal takedown using the strength of the law is a fantastic upending of everything we'd seen from domain expansion and other related abilities up until then. So, what exactly is Higuruma's power? Deadly sentencing, his domain expansion, takes the form of a courtroom surrounded on all sides by wicked-looking guillotines that appear to be constantly rising and dropping, slicing up the ground beneath them. Both Higuruma and his opponent are placed within witness stands, taking on the role of prosecutor and defendant, as a sinister Shikigami called Judge Man looms behind Higuruma himself. The domain isn't lethal. Instead, the battle is fought by adhering to the terms of the law itself and doesn't allow actual physical fighting to take place within. And herein is perhaps what I enjoy the most about this power on show already. There's a real sense of commitment, of follow through with this ability. Gege could have easily dressed up a fairly standard domain expansion in the trappings of a courtroom setting and called it a day. But I love the fact that it plays strictly by the book, even if that's antithetical to how most fights go. Judge Man itself is another cool element to this setup. It's a creepy, jet-black, ghost-like creature, a shadowy shroud save for a pale white mask-like face with its eyes sewn shut and a pair of scales dangling from either, I guess you could call them appendages, although they're not really. Judge Man is the key component to this domain. He is what it essentially revolves around, perhaps even more so than Higuruma himself. It reads aloud the charges against the accused, and as Higuruma explains, knows everything about everyone sealed within the domain. There's a horror element to this power too, a horror element that comes about thanks to Judge Man's design. The way Judge Man's face contorts into a terrifying, ghoulish scream when it delivers its harshest verdict is very unnerving and lends a sense of disturbing finality to the proceedings. When it delivers a normal verdict, albeit still a punishment, Judge Man retains this kind of inhuman composure, and that makes it all the more haunting when it explodes into madness when it delivers the death penalty. But anyway, back to the power itself, which we see properly for the first time in a duel with Yuji early in the culling game. With the stage set and neither fighter allowed to use violence of any kind, Judge Man lays down the law. Higuruma explains that while Judge Man knows everything about the two participants within the domain, he isn't privy to that same information. He doesn't get any special treatment in that regard, and I enjoy that. It's an intriguing way of balancing deadly sentencing somewhat, even if it does still lean heavily in the favour of the prosecutor. Instead, the verdict, and therefore the outcome and effect of deadly sentencing itself, will be determined solely by the arguments each combatant presents. A sealed dossier then appears in Higuruma's hand, and he reveals that there is evidence contained within, which has been submitted to him by Judge Man for deliberation. While the defendant isn't told what's inside the envelope, it's not necessarily conclusive either. meaning it might not be enough to successfully convict on its own. Therefore, it is Higuruma's job to take the answer that Yuji gives, combine it with the evidence that's been submitted to him, and deliver a powerful statement convincing Judgman of the defendant's guilt. Deadly sentencing is much more akin to the domains of old, which, as opposed to necessarily being lethal, simply required those trapped within to follow a subset of rules. Higuruma would later reveal that the evidence submitted into the trial is actually shared with the sorcerer themselves beforehand, meaning Higuruma always knew what was inside the letter, thereby inherently giving him an advantage. Each fighter has one chance to make a statement. In this particular instance, Yuji will go first, essentially outlining his position, and giving him the first chance to make a move. Higuruma then gets the opportunity to make his statement afterwards, a rebuttal based on the evidence that he gets to look at after Yuji has spoken, though as I just mentioned, he does already know what it is. As the defendant, Yuji has 3 options available to him. He can either confess to his supposed crime in the hopes of a lighter sentence, though as he notes, he has no idea if the domain actually works in that way, if it would actually allow such a thing. He can completely deny it, claim it to not be the truth at all, or he can stay completely silent. Of course, choosing any of these will have repercussions depending on how the trial plays out, and so we, the reader, get to engage in this exciting meta game where we get to watch the defendant try and choose what's the best path forward for them, the route that will hopefully lead them to safety. I think that's another thing I really enjoy about this power. It feels like there are quite a lot of layers intrinsically attached to it. There's quite a lot going on, though it manages to remain somewhat simplistic on the surface. Okay, so in this example, everything is in place. What's the charge? Judgman declares that Yuji stands accused of entering a pachinko parlor in Sendai despite being under the age of 18 at the time, thereby breaking the law. Now, Judgman doesn't just pluck this out of nowhere. It was established early on that he knows everything about both players at the same time. The question is whether or not Yuji can convince the domain of his innocence. Though I admit I did find that somewhat confusing. If Judgman knows literally everything about everyone, then surely he already knows whether or not Yuji is innocent or guilty? I'm not sure. Perhaps the way the domain plays out for the defendant is essentially just based on the performance they give here now. Whether they're able to circumvent the evidence or not, I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, Yuji immediately remembers going to the parlor and even winning in there, but he doesn't want to be found guilty, so again he has those 3 options. Yet all of this hangs in the balance, as he has to make his statement without knowing what's in the evidence envelope that will potentially help Higuruma's case, and may lead to whatever statement Yuji gives blowing up in his face. I've said this a few times now, but honestly, I really do love this power. Not only is it really creative, but it is clever too, turning the judiciary system into what feels like a game of chess, a turn-based battle of words playing out between the 2 sorcerers. In this example, Yuji weighs up his options and decides that the evidence probably points to him being at the parlor in some form or another. So rather than deny it outright, he claims he did go there, but only to use the toilet, not to gamble. Now it's Higuruma's turn and he opens the envelope. Inside is a security camera image of Yuji standing at a cash exchange window near the parlor on the day of the crime, and Higuruma deduces that since Yuji confessed to going inside and that there's photo evidence of him at a cash machine, it's clear he went in with the intention to gamble, not to solely use the bathroom as he stated. While Yuji growls that there was no way for him to win, Higuruma corrects him. Gambling is forbidden under Japanese law, so pachinko parlors and cash exchanges are completely separate legal entities. Yuji is only on trial for entering the parlor, not for standing at a cash exchange. Therefore, had he denied going into the parlor at all rather than lying about using the bathroom, he probably would have gotten away with it, as the evidence doesn't point to him visiting the parlor explicitly. Therefore, if Yuji had said that he hadn't gone to the parlor, he'd never seen it before, Higuruma would have had nothing on him. He would have opened the envelope and seen Yuji at a cash exchange and had to kind of be like, okay, well, I guess you're off the hook. But as a result, Yuji is found guilty and Judgeman issues a sentence. In the first instance, Judgeman activates confiscation, which normally makes it temporarily impossible to use cursed techniques. However, against Yuji, it prevents him from using cursed energy at all. Later, Yuji exposes a potential loophole in deadly sentencing by demanding a retrial, which Judgeman has to allow since Yuji never confessed to the crime himself. But this allows Judgeman to accuse him of a different crime entirely, as they now have to look at something else. This time it's mass murder in Shibuya, which of course Yuji didn't commit, but he feels the weight of Sukuna's actions at the time and blames himself at this point in the story. So he simply confesses to the crime anyway, and an enraged Judgeman explodes, not only activating confiscation, but also Higuruma's ultimate power as well: death penalty. Now, there's one thing I haven't mentioned thus far, and that's Higuruma's gavel. The gavel is Higuruma's weapon of choice, a unique melee weapon that again fits his theme in a cohesive and fantastic way, and helps him to continue to stand out from the crowd. The gavel is extremely brutal and powerful on its own, acting as a sort of hammer, but Higuruma is able to transport it from one hand to the other in the blink of an eye, as well as freely change its shape and size in the midst of battle. The gavel can either be elongated, turning it into slightly more of a ranged weapon, akin to a polearm of sorts, or the actual head of the gavel itself can become massive and inflated, transforming the weapon into a sledgehammer-like device. But the punishment of death penalty takes the gavel to its final, coolest stage, the natural, most extreme end of the road for Higuruma's lore-themed powers. The cross affixed to the side of the gavel gleams a brilliant glow, and the gavel itself is replaced by a shimmering sword made entirely of light, the Executioner's Sword. Now giving Higuruma the appearance of a holy warrior or knight, a dispenser of justice, the Executioner's Sword is the harshest sentence that can be doled out by Judgeman. Anyone cut, even slightly, by the Executioner's Sword is guaranteed to die. And so I like the way that turns the idea of the sure hit domain on its head in a sense, handing that power directly to Higuruma, giving him that power in his hands, but also changing it around slightly. Gone is the idea of it being a sure hit. Instead, it is a sure kill if he manages to land it. In this instance, though, Higuruma knew that Yuji wasn't guilty, as we said earlier. He already knew the evidence that had been submitted to him, and he knew that it implicated Sukuna instead of him, and so had been wrongfully accused in Sukuna's place, leading Higuruma to dispel the sword of his own volition in remembrance of his roots as a lawyer who used to strive to help those who found themselves exactly in Yuji's current position. Deadly sentencing does make a return later on in the series, but for now we will leave it there. Ultimately, deadly sentencing is just one of the coolest, most creative powers in the series, and I adore it. Higuruma's entire character works so well, hence why he made my list of my favourite Jujutsu Kaisen characters. A self-contained delight who blends his talent as a lawyer with his newfound sorcery, becoming incredibly dangerous and strong as a result. Deadly sentencing is a fantastic example of what a well-thought-out and coherent ability set can really look like. One that was seemingly designed in conjunction from the ground up with the character themselves, and one that plays off their strengths. Jujutsu Kaisen is full of fascinating, sometimes convoluted, but always interesting powers. And for me, this is at the very top of the pile, and I can't wait to see it brought to life in the anime. Alright everyone, well that's it for today's video. As always, I really hope you enjoyed it and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. Let me know down in the comments, what do you think of Higuruma and specifically his ability of deadly sentencing? Do you like it as much as I do? Do you enjoy how it was used and showcased in the source material in not just the example against Yuji, but later on in the story as well? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. And as always, I want to end the video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my supporters over on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you so very much. If you love what I do here over on YouTube and you want to help support me that extra step further, thank you. By visiting the link to my Patreon in the description down below, you can help support me at the $1 a month level to get your name in the credits of every video just like this. And for $2 and up, you can get every video I release absolutely free of baked in YouTube ads. Alright everyone, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.